The date is November 24, 1988. Beneath the soaring roof of the Richfield Coliseum in Ohio, a haze of adrenaline and cheap hairspray hang over 13,000 screaming fans. It is Thanksgiving night. Banners ripple up to the rafters alongside placards bearing the name of Macho Man. Down in the ring, the main event is closing in a crescendo of scripted triumph. Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, the reigning world heavyweight champion, have just vanquished the team led by the Twin Towers, Akeem and the Big Boss Man, in a frantic elimination match. The referee's hand strikes the canvas for the final 3 count, and the crowd explodes into a roar that shakes the Coliseum's foundations. On the surface, this moment represents the absolute zenith of the World Wrestling Federation's golden era, a masterclass in family-friendly myth-making. Hogan cups his hand behind his ear, pacing the ring to absorb the adulation of children who see him not as an athlete, but as a living superhero. Savage raises his arm in victory while Miss Elizabeth smiles for the cameras. It's a picture-perfect snapshot of a multi-million-dollar empire firing on all cylinders, an idealized world where good triumphs over evil and the righteous are rewarded with gold and glory. Yet look closer at the grain of the broadcast, past the smiles and the celebratory poses, and a far more sinister narrative takes shape. The triumph of the megapowers was not the beginning of an era, but the funeral of an entire industry. The bright lights of the Richfield Coliseum were designed to obscure a landscape of corporate ruthlessness, shattered bodies, and a locker room toxic with paranoia. The 1988 Survivor Series was the exact coordinate where wrestling stopped being a gritty regional sport and became a cold, predatory national monopoly. To understand the dark side of this night, we have to examine the wreckage Vince McMahon left behind to build this stage. Look at the predatory architecture of the pay-per-view model itself. Just a few years earlier, professional wrestling was a sprawling, decentralized ecosystem, governed by the National Wrestling Alliance, a cartel of regional promoters who respected territorial boundaries. A wrestler could make a living traveling from the Pacific Northwest to the Mid-Atlantic, from Calgary to Florida, a blue-collar trade embedded in local communities. Vince McMahon envisioned a monolithic television empire instead, and the Survivor Series was conceived as a weapon of economic destruction. The inaugural 1987 event existed for the explicit purpose of sabotaging Jim Crockett Promotions' Starrcade, forcing cable companies to choose the World Wrestling Federation over its competitors. By 1988, that strategy had succeeded. The territories weren't just dying, they were being systematically dismantled. The ringside area at the Richfield Coliseum was populated by refugees from those broken territories, men who had once headlined sold-out arenas across the South, now repackaged as cartoon characters to fill slots in McMahon's Grand Parade. The aesthetic of this event reveals the first symptom of that takeover, the aggressive dawn of the cartoon era. Wrestling had traditionally been presented as a legitimate combat sport, populated by rugged men and legitimate street fighters. By late 1988, McMahon was pivoting entirely toward family entertainment, action figures, and Saturday morning syndication. The roster compiled for this card is an absurdist gallery of hyper-stylized gimmicks. Terry Taylor, one of the most technically gifted wrestlers of his generation, was forced to strut and cluck as the Red Rooster, a gimmick reportedly designed by Vince McMahon himself over Taylor's own objections, specifically to strip him of any credibility he'd built. Akeem, previously the fearsome one-man gang, was a wrestler repackaged weeks earlier into an offensive caricature of an African tribal dancer. The message was clear: individual artistry and athletic credibility were dead. The corporate machine owned the intellectual property, and the wrestlers were flesh-and-blood avatars built to sell plastic merchandise to children. That transformation required a specific kind of performer, larger-than-life titans who looked like comic book drawings brought to life. And that requirement introduced the deepest shadow over the entire event: the unchecked proliferation of anabolic steroids. To hold a spot on a Vince McMahon card in 1988, a wrestler needed an unnatural, hyper-exaggerated physique. The locker room that night was an ecosystem fueled by chemical enhancement, where men injected themselves with experimental substances to maintain monstrous proportions while working a 300-day travel schedule with no health insurance, no off-season, and no union protection. The Ultimate Warrior, Dynamite Kid, the Big Boss Man, Rick Rude, Davey Boy Smith, and Kurt Hennig would all die prematurely in the years that followed, their deaths tied directly to the chemical and physical demands of this era, a corporate entity that would replace each of them the moment their bodies gave out. That physical toll was embodied most poignantly that night by André the Giant. To the fans in Richfield, André was still the eighth wonder of the world. But backstage, the reality was heartbreaking. André was suffering the advanced effects of acromegaly. His spine was collapsing under his own weight, his knees were bone on bone, and every step was an exercise in agony. He could no longer bump, and his participation in the elimination match was limited to short bursts of choking and leaning against the turnbuckle. Yet the corporate machine couldn't afford to let him rest. He was too valuable a drawing card, too essential a foil for the younger babyfaces. He was marched out to the ring, a broken giant kept upright by sheer willpower, trapped in a body failing him, serving an audience that demanded he remain a monster until his last breath. While André's body broke down, Vince McMahon was already preparing for the future. In the opening match, the Ultimate Warrior emerged as sole survivor of his team, eliminating Ron Bass and Greg Valentine in the final minute to an explosion of fan euphoria. On television, it was a righteous ascension. Backstage, it was a calculated maneuver. The Warrior was an unpolished, technically limited worker who relied entirely on intensity and a granite physique. By pushing him to the moon at the expense of established craftsmen like Valentine, the front office sent a clear message to the roster. Your ability to wrestle doesn't matter. Your dedication to the craft is irrelevant. The company valued the look, the marketability, and total compliance with the corporate brand. The veterans in the back watched Warriors rise with a mixture of resentment and fear, realizing the art of professional wrestling was being replaced by a manufactured, interchangeable spectacle. Nowhere was that manufactured spectacle more volatile than in the real-life friction developing between the two men at the center of the poster. The Mega Powers alliance of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage was the most lucrative narrative engine the business had ever produced. But by November of 1988, the line between scripted drama and genuine tension had blurred. Savage was a man possessed by intense, consuming jealousy over his wife and manager, Miss Elizabeth, monitoring her every interaction with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. Hogan, meanwhile, was the industry's undisputed alpha. A shrewd political operator who understood his position required him to remain the focal point of every frame of television. During the climax of the match against the Twin Towers, Hogan was handcuffed to the ring post, forcing Savage to absorb a brutal, prolonged beating alone. It was Savage who took the punishment and showed the grit of a champion. Yet when the match ended, it was Hogan who broke free. Hogan who rushed to comfort Elizabeth, and Hogan who took center stage for the celebration. To the audience, it was high drama. To Randy Savage, it was a calculated insult. Watch the footage as the show closes. Savage's eyes aren't on his belt or the crowd. They're radiating a genuine, tightly wound fury as Hogan playfully interacts with Elizabeth. That real-world jealousy was a ticking time bomb. 2 months later, at the Royal Rumble, the tension would manifest in an accidental elimination, followed by a backstage confrontation, culminating in their real-life fallout. McMahon didn't defuse this bomb. He commodified it, taking the genuine erosion of a real marriage and a real friendship and transforming it into the main event of WrestleMania 5. Even the tag team division, showcased that night in a massive 42-minute, 10-on-10 elimination match, reflected this theme of disposability. Demolition, the reigning tag champions, were the despised villains. Yet during this very match, the company executed a double turn, shifting Demolition babyface while turning the Powers of Pain heel alongside Mr. Fuji. It was slick business, but it exposed the erratic, disposable nature of the roster. The company could pivot an entire identity on a dime based on merchandising projections. Acts like the Young Stallions and Strikeforce were systematically dismantled the moment their utility to the central narrative waned. Performers like Jake Roberts and Bad News Brown, despite immense charisma, hit a glass ceiling, too real, too unrefined for the corporate mold, doomed to remain mid-card attractions, while the company's marketing muscle went entirely toward a select few superheroes. The undercard match pitting Jake Roberts and Jim Duggan's team against Andre's stacked squad carried its own quiet tragedy, one that never made the broadcast. The match was originally supposed to feature Junkyard Dog, one of the company's most beloved black performers, but the Junkyard Dog walked away from the company before the show over a pay dispute, a grievance that had been building for years. His replacement, B. Brian Blair, also left the company before bell time, forcing a second last-minute substitution in journeyman Scott Casey. Two departures scrambling one match's lineup in the days before a major pay-per-view wasn't a coincidence. It was a symptom of a roster quietly fed up with what the company was willing to pay the men filling its arenas. Ken Patera, meanwhile, made his final Federation appearance that same night. A quiet, undramatic fade-out for a wrestler who had once been positioned as a legitimate monster. No angle marked the occasion. He simply lost, and he was gone. When the final bell rang at the Richfield Coliseum that Thanksgiving night, and thousands of fans filed into the cold Ohio air, they believed they'd witnessed a celebration of heroism. They didn't know they'd witnessed the consolidation of an empire that would leave the sport unrecognizable within a decade. The 1988 Survivor Series remains a monument to the genius of Vince McMahon, but it's a monument built on broken lives. It was the night the territories drew their final breath, the night the cartoon aesthetic became law, and the night the toxic cocktail of steroids and corporate apathy became standard operating procedure. The survivors standing in the ring under the confetti were Hogan and Savage, but the true survivor was the corporation itself, an entity that devoured the health, the friendships, and the identities of its performers, all to ensure the show, cold and profitable, would never have to stop.